I always say, like, get something out there. Like, the faster you can get a prototype out there and in front of that user, you're going to get better feedback from them when they're hands-on than you're going to get by just kind of talking about the problem, right? Because when you're just talking about the problem, they're like, well, the algorithm's not going to know this, and we got to like do this and that, and
So I think
that's what I've seen. Like, make them react to something is always a better plan.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. I'm your co-host, Vijay Mehrotra, and on behalf of my co-host, Michael Watson, who's with us today, I'm thrilled to introduce Carolyn Mooney as our guest today. Carolyn's career fascinates me because she has, from her undergraduate degree forward, been focused on systems and quite complex systems along the way. Things in the military that she's not allowed to talk to me about, delivery systems, algorithms, as well as complex IT operations that aren't allowed to fail. And having the responsibility of designing, developing, and owning systems like that, she thinks a lot about decisions. In her company, Nextmv has really kind of there's been one of the early people coining this term DecisionOps. And we got a lot of things to talk to Carolyn about, but I think the first thing we want to ask her is, Carolyn, what's your elevator pitch on DecisionOps? What is DecisionOps?
Oh, no, it's awesome. And thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation today and what you all have been doing in the decision intelligence space. Really, at the end of the day, decision ops is a set of tooling, right, and processes and standards for getting decisions live within your organization. So what we find is that, decision systems really are serving the needs of multiple teams within your org. You have modelers and algorithm engineers that are building them. You have software engineers that are leveraging them, for the back end of various systems or providing data to the end user in some manner. And then you have the business who's actually benefiting from the outcomes, right? Whether it's better routes for drivers, right, or better workforce schedules or better prices, right, for services that are listing millions of SKUs, right? At the end of the day, like these types of systems have a really big revenue and cost impact. And so that's really where decision ops comes in, is kind of reducing the friction to get those live and building trust within the organization.
Are those systems, or you sell that to, is it your customer, the IT department who's maintaining this code, or is it the operations research team who's building the models?
It's actually both. Quite frequently, our main user is like an operations research team or a decision science team is kind of what we see a lot of them calling themselves today, or sometimes even data science with optimization focus. But yeah, that's our core user. And we really want them to be able to create a system that their business users can test and understand. I heard this term recently, like they want to create clear box systems versus black box systems. And I really liked that. I like to be able to see in and kind of inquire, what different levers do to my decision making. What does it look like if I have double the amount of order volume, tomorrow for my inventory management system? Like, what is that going to do? And so I think these types of questions are where I've lived in my career, especially around like simulation. And I've always worked with operators at all of the companies that I've been at. And they always have those types of questions and they want to have an intuition about how the automation is going to impact their bottom line.
Yeah, look, there are so many problems within this world of decisions on different timescales with different things on the line and different levels of complexity and local information. I'm kind of super curious as to how Nextmv, kind of how you started and how the journey brought you to where you are now with this decision ops focus, and what some of the pits were along the way.
Yeah, for sure. So when we started the company back in 2019, my co-founder Ryan and I had both just come from Grubhub. So we were building and maintaining real-time systems for meal delivery logistics, right? So everything from forecasting and scheduling, automated dispatch, real-time supply demand management, ETAs. I used to joke if you had a bad ETA from Grubhub, it might have been my fault at some point. But we were building those systems and we just found that we were we were always ending up, I think Doug Gray mentioned this on the podcast you guys had with him earlier, you end up in someone else's backlog. So we actually really felt like that. Like we were building these, algorithms to solve these business problems. And we're trying to give the operations team a really good sense for what the performance of that model or that algorithm is going to be. But we'd end up kind of in this cycle of getting things live with the engineering team. And that was, by the way, to no fault of their own, right? They were doing a fantastic job of getting those systems live and scalable. It was just a lot of effort. And so when we started Nextmv, we really wanted to do two things. Like one, build trust within the organization faster. So we had a concept around kind of online simulation and testing frameworks that we thought should be, just a standard. And we also wanted to kind of reduce that level of effort for engineering. And so over time, what this kind of has evolved into is, how you have ML ops for something like a data science or data ops, right? In the data engineering world, well, we need the equivalent in the decision science space. And so we said, we need decision ops. And there are some key aspects to that for experimentation and things like, always store the input and output of your decisions, make sure they're reproducible, store different versions over time. And key to all of this is make sure your operations team, your end user, has access to the model and can do some testing on their own, because that's how they build trust.
And along the way, clearly the delivery world has got all of this live updating data and a need to reoptimize and it has to always be on. Are there other key spaces where you guys have found that this tooling can make a difference and where there's a lot of traction, a lot of curiosity because bam, it helps us solve a big problem for us?
Yeah, for sure. I think the interesting thing, so when we started the company, it was 2019. Obviously, COVID happened, right, and kicked off in 2020, and really kind of changed the landscape and of a lot of industries, but definitely the supply chain industry. And so I think, in our space, oftentimes people think immediately about the traveling salesman problem or traveling salesperson problem, right? And multi-vehicle routing. I think that is the one that people are like, yep, that's an optimization thing immediately. And I think that kind of makes sense, right? Because it's last mile, right? So everyone thinks about it at the end, right? But I'm a systems engineer, so I'm like, hey, let's work 4 steps back from that, because there's probably things about the system that trickle down. And so what we've seen is that yes, supply chain is certainly a large industry for things like optimization and decision-making technology, for sure. But I think it's interesting that other spaces and industries are starting to play a little bit more in the game, where they traditionally had been more strategic, maybe optimization or decision making. They're starting to get more into tactical or real-time optimization. And I think that's because of a few industry trends, like availability of data, cloud compute being a heck of a lot cheaper, the solvers that are in this space being a lot faster, right? So when you are able to make decisions faster with data that's available, fundamentally your operational capabilities change, right? You can say maybe you can take orders a lot later, or you don't have to decide where your inventory is going to be positioned, immediately. You can decide next day, that sort of thing. And so I think that that's really what we've been seeing is a lot of applications that are kicking up in retail, energy industry, finance, stuff like that, over time. But we certainly started out in the classic supply chain, given our background, for sure.
Can I dive in on more? You mentioned that your DecisionOps has simulation capability, and simulation is used in lots of different ways to represent everything from discrete event simulation to scenario management. How do you think about simulation and sort of how are your users using it to
Yes.
gain trust?
It certainly has a variety of different definitions. I mean, I worked on everything from agent-based simulation to discrete event simulation and others as well. I would say that I most often see organizations trying to do things like scenario testing or Monte Carlo type simulation with a specific decision model that they have. And so that's a lot of where we've focused thus far today. The interesting thing about our platform is that you could actually, if you are building an agent-based simulation or you are building a discrete event simulation, you could host that simulation on our platform also and be able to call out to other decision models that are kind of components of it. So certainly a variety of different ways. But when we think about our experimentation stack, we're really trying to get you from prototype to production really quickly. And so we have things like, batch testing where you can do historical testing on a lot of different data sets for the same model. We also have acceptance testing, more like CI/CD for your models. And then also the scenario testing, I think, is just like parameter tuning is kind of where I would say that sits, where you can do a variety of different data sets, a variety of different configurations, and kind of see how those play out.
It's interesting. There's a couple of different directions I wanted to go, but the one I want to jump on is just because we got on a testing. Can you say a little bit about kind of uh, how your clients and your users think about testing and kind of how you guys have provided tooling to support different types of testing?
I think this so if you think about like, classic like software development, right? You would have like you have unit tests, you have integration tests, right? And you kind of like move up the ranks in terms of like sophistication to get a software product live. And I think what we realized is that having those checks and balances, especially when you're working on a team that's all working towards, the same algorithm development or maybe multiple algorithms that interact with each other, it's really nice to kind of have that same workup, right? And to be able to share those results along the way. I think that's a really big deal. And so when we think about, kind of that testing, capability, there's local testing for sure. Like we do have a CLI tool, an SDK tool that allows you to do a lot of like local runs and understand kind of performance when you're doing development, right? So I think that's important. And then once you hit the point where you're like, yes, I think this is like pretty good or pretty solid, I want to get some other eyes on it. When we have a lot of our users that integrate our testing capabilities on our platform with their CI/CD platforms, right? So as they create new PRs, right, for their Git repositories, tests kick off automatically. That means they can store input sets and share them across their organization, right? So maybe it's like three different regions, like the order volume for Philadelphia and the order volume for LA, and they're stored as single input files or whatever within your app, right? And I can share it with Michael, who's also on my team, and we can run against the same data sets. And so like that stuff is really helpful because it's standardized like how you test, and you can update those test sets over time. And so now you're managing those as a team, and really those are the ways that you kind of like build that trust, right? And also just like reporting on the same metrics, right? We have like a format for statistics for these types of plans, right? So if I'm reporting on vehicle routing, I might care about the number of vehicles I'm using. If I'm reporting on a scheduling algorithm, I might care about overage hours, right? So like having a standard, almost like a data dictionary for the metrics you care about, right, for your plan is something that we focus on as part of that testing suite, right? So it's being able to store inputs, being able to have standard metrics, right, and then you have the same views every time you're looking at these tests.
I think that's so important. I've seen, software developers have their own tests and they have all their own
Right.
models, so they know how to do that. But end customers don't tend to do that. And I think it's a great tool to help teach the end user community, like you need to build up these tests that have inputs and you know what the outputs are. So when you make changes, you can
Exactly, so that
adjust.
like, "Oh, wow, like, against the same data set, I got a 5% predicted improvement," right? I mean, that's kind of where we wanna be,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And we want them to understand that, and I really do think that with the advent of the, ChatGPT and just, like, LLMs in general, most operation teams really want to be able to have a conversation with their data, right? Or have some intuition about what a model is going to do, and that really helps people get comfortable with it, right?
Yes.
It helps people like understand that yes, like when I have five more, workers show up tomorrow, I know the system is going to do something reasonable with those people, right?
Right.
Or
Yeah.
so I think that's a big part of the trust and scaling thing. I've sat down like next to dispatchers, right? When Ryan and I were at Zoomer, which is the startup we were at before Grubhub, and I was shocked at just the amount of information that they were having to look at the same time, right?
Right.
It's like they're looking at these massive maps. They have a whole list of drivers. Like there's all this stuff going on, and I was just fascinated. And I think they at the time they were hiring like the best video gamers to try to do this because they could handle all the screens.
Okay. Oh, cool. Cool
Yeah.
idea. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually have seen some data on this. The kind of the cognitive load we're putting on people in these kind of frontline decision-making role has sort of like tripled the number of apps that we expect them to keep track of,
Yes,
has
I can
doubled
see
over the
that.
last 10 years. And so all that information kind of comes with its own kind of verbiage, data dictionary,
Yep.
and way of looking at the world that Shazam No wonder these guys are dispatchers. I honestly believe that they must have such deep intuition built up,
They do, and they have, like,
right?
fascinating insights, right? Like, you're sitting next to them and you're like, "Why did you, like, split that order up?" Or, "Why did you, know that this person, like, can go to this, particular location or has, like, access there?" And they're just like, "Oh, yeah, like, I know, that driver has this and that," and, like, they just have this, like, running list of, like, boots on the ground knowledge that is so valuable, and I think one of the, I sat with a team the other day where they sit alongside their operations team, and I was like, that's the best setup you could possibly have. Like the tech team
Uh,
literally sits next to the operations
Right.
team. And I was like, that's so good because I think where you see successful decision systems is where there's a really tight feedback loop between the operation and those engineers, whether they be algorithm engineers or software engineers, either way, right? It's the classic as a software engineer, you want feedback faster, right, from your users. It's the same thing, right? For our users in the
yeah,
algorithm space are the operation, like the folks.
So
right.
I think I have a question that's kind of related to that, but it'll sound technical, but I think it ties back to how you get these build trust.
Yeah,
And that has to do with what I call hierarchical optimization, which other people might call differently. So basically you run with an objective, let's say minimize cost, and then you say, well, I'll sacrifice a tiny bit of cost to get a lot more service. And I just have this feeling that that leads to much more human-like decisions. Like if, as a manager, I'm happy to pay an extra 0.5% cost if I get a 30% bump in service. Like,
yeah,
can you comment
100%.
on that? Like what you've seen in that when you build these real-time systems as hierarchical optimization or something like that?
For sure, for sure. I think there's like two aspects to that. When I started at Zoomer, we had like a multi-objective optimization, and it was very complex. And what that led to is like it was hard to understand why certain decisions were being made, right? And so I think it was at the when I came on and started doing like simulation around it. I think it was like 13 or 14 parameters, right? And like so I'm like sitting there trying to
Yeah.
tune coefficients, and I was like, well, I'm not exactly sure what the biggest impact is here. And so I started ripping a bunch of them out, to be honest with you, right? I was like, let's just get it down to something super simple. And most of the time, these systems are exactly what you said. They're basically a balance between service and cost, right? And those are usually orthogonal to each other,
Right.
and there's no free lunch.
Right.
That's the first statement to everybody, right? But I think what you're saying is accurate. Like people are thinking about these systems sometimes as building workflows, and we've actually really leaned into that. We have a part of our product is built around architecting decision workflows and orchestrating them. And when you do that, like there's obviously some solver tech out there that helps you do hierarchical optimization. You could do that within your model itself, and those are really powerful tools. You can also think about using multiple technologies in sequence, right? You might use like a heuristic to get a really good first solution that has maybe it is minimizing costs, right? And then you pass it into another mixed integer programming model, right? And that's, doing a different type of
Yeah.
optimization to have your second tier. And so we really feel that that modelers and algorithm engineers and software engineers need like the tooling to make those pipelines possible. And in a predictable way, right? And be able to kind of surface the levers to their operations team to play with those metrics, right? Hey, I'm okay with a 10% loss here, and that's what we should be optimizing towards. There's also some really new like cool solver tech I think that's coming out that deals a lot more with uncertainty than and the worlds of simulation and optimization are like solvers are definitely blending. I think
Okay.
as time goes forward.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, Carolyn, the way you described it, and I think it's a nice way to think about it is I was thinking about the data pipeline and the algorithms and ingesting it, but it really is just this kind of ridiculously long value chain, and you're only as good as sort of your weakest link. So as we solidify the technologies in that world, who owns it? Who's got responsibilities and accountabilities for it? And what kind of skill sets do those people have?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Like oftentimes the way we think about our system and the way I would say that I've been talking about, decision ops is everybody kind of has their own view into that clear box, right? And so I think like when I think about, settings for an optimization for like a region or for a population, I think those are the keys that the operation should own, right? Like your algorithm engineers or your decision engineers are building systems, but they might not have the boots on the ground knowledge of, hey, we're running a marketing campaign in, the Northeast, next week.
Right.
And so I need to change my balance, right, of service level versus cost, right? And I really want to prioritize service level for this marketing campaign because I want more people to be repeat users for me, right? And so I think when we think about configuration of the system, I think oftentimes some of that configuration, maybe not all of it, but some of that configuration should be owned actually by the operators themselves, right? And managed in a repeatable way, of course, but and version and all the things. But I think like that's part of it. I think the decision making like rules themselves, that's like something where I think the decision engineer, right, or decision scientist, right, is really on the hook there for understanding kind of that pipeline and those data contracts, right, with the model that they create. And then the software engineer that's integrating these systems, right, should have an API layer that they understand and they maintain. And like we've been really adamant that like all decisions should look and feel the same. That API should have the same components. You should have like access to your run history. You should have access to versions. You should have access to configuration. And maybe the input data changes for different decisions, but the structure of the API doesn't change. Does that answer your question?
Oh, above and beyond, actually, because I'm going back down to your first chunk of you had my attention with your very first group. I totally agree that the business should, in the end, they're on the hook for delivering the numbers, whatever the numbers are,
100%.
whatever the
Yeah,
metrics are. And so, weirdly, they need to understand this stuff more than they do, because without it, the assumption is they're gonna lose to somebody who's using it.
yeah, or like honestly, beyond that, even like they are. I liked what you said about like they're on the hook, right, for the
Right.
performance of the system, and I think that is really true. Like I think we sometimes treat them not necessarily as our customers when we're building these algorithms,
Yes.
but I think we should, right? They're our customers. They are trying to provide more value to the business and they need to understand how to use the automation effectively. And I think that that's like where some of these systems fall over, is that we don't kind of like work with them and have them test things iteratively. And I've seen a couple like interesting talks on that recently, like where people say, hey, like I need to build a user interface for my operations team so that they can understand what's going on and understand what levers they have to pull.
Right.
Right? How can they change the answer?
Yeah, related to that, you have a great term, this clear box.
Yeah.
But, like, how do you there's a trade-off that I feel in my head is that when you work with a client, they give you lots and lots of constraints and
Yep.
minimums and this, and they build this complicated model, which by definition is gonna be hard to explain.
Yeah.
How do you manage that trade-off there, like, between coaching your clients, like, you need to be able to understand this versus you wanna capture all the nuances of the business?
For sure, for sure. I mean, a lot of our users, right, are the decision engineers themselves, right? They're building these algorithms for their end users within their companies, and something we talk about a lot with these like operations research type folks is, how do you like crawl, walk, run? Like simple, always greater than complex, right?
Okay, yeah.
To start, just to understand kind of like what is happening. I do think that so I've lived that, right? Like hey, here's the laundry list of constraints, here's the laundry list of things we want to prioritize. That's how we ended up with a super long objective function, right? The one I referenced before. But I think a lot of that has to do with getting stuck in kind of like the waterfall type approach to planning and the preconceived notion about what data you need to make a decision. I think the most fascinating thing that I've heard like sometimes from people is we don't have the data to make this decision today, so we're just not going to make it. I'm like, but you're making it today.
You're
Right?
making
You're
it.
making, like you have a decision service today. They're sitting at a desk at your HQ, right, and they have
Yeah.
all the rules in their head. So if you want to like understand your performance and measure your performance, like you need to start codifying those rules. And you can go from I think there's a mistake that we jump straight to optimization, like or jump straight to simulation. That's very complex, right? Versus just working our way up, right? What if you just capture like the input that you have today and you codify the business rules, which are just maybe it's just a BPMN type model, and that's fine, right? But just put that into code first, and then maybe it's a set of thresholds, maybe it's a set of if then statements. Great, now you have a very defined API or box that you can start improving over time, and that can level up to a heuristic, that can level up to an optimization, that can level up to a simulation or multi-model like optimization, all the things. But if you don't kind of define that box and draw it, then then it becomes very hard to kind of manage that over time. And so we I always say, like, get something out there. Like, the faster you can get a prototype out there and in front of that user, you're going to get better feedback from them when they're hands-on than you're going to get by just kind of talking about the problem, right? Because when you're just talking about the problem, they're like, well, the algorithm's not going to know this, and we got to like do this and that, and
I think it,
that's like
it's
that's what I've seen. Like, make them react to something is always a better plan.
but I think in a way that also if you can start the conversation around their decisions rather than on the tech, it does make a huge difference. Partly because honestly, I feel like, as I mentioned this earlier, they're being pummeled with systems, right? Sometimes it feels like there's sort of 5% of the people running like crazy in the middle, and 95% of them trying to get them to run faster.
Yeah. No, for sure. For sure. And I think that's right. Like, they have too many tools today. Like, what you really want to build that trust, right, is them to react. Like, if you give them a sample like decision, a set of prices that you're gonna set for this, pricing optimization.
Yeah.
And they're like, those are wildly out of bounds. You didn't consider like competitor prices. You didn't consider this. Then you know what you need to go get. Right.
Right.
Versus if you just kind of sit in the beginning there, you just end up in this endless data cycle. And I think you also end up in an endless like predictive cycle too. Like, you end up spending more time on predictive models than actually like, providing
Right.
like automation speed with decision making. So
It's sometimes hard, to get. Sometimes you can't get anywhere if you can't agree on some metric or metric framework
yeah,
about what good is,
yeah.
right? And because you can't talk about better if you haven't defined good.
Yes, baselining
Yeah.
is also a big thing, which is why kind of taking the steps from, manual to automated to like,
Yes.
optimized or simulated is so important, because in that process, effectively what you're doing is decoupling your data like from your decision making like, engine. And by doing that, you can baseline, even if it's just take in the current solution, right, and print it out for me. And here are the metrics I care about. I summarize all the time, because every operator that I have ever met has a very deep knowledge of how they grade their like
Yes.
what's going on.
Exactly.
And they have more metrics than I could ever imagine usually on those systems, and usually quite complex spreadsheets actually, just to measure what's going on in like large
Right.
data sets. So really codifying those metrics, I think, is something that we've tried to give like a formatted space to as well, right? And that API allows you to do a lot of interesting things with experimentation and testing over time.
I've had trouble with this in the past. You got a mission in passing, like get something out in front of the user so they can react, which is completely right. But also, it's a little more nuanced than that too, because you still want to have credibility. Like, if you put something in front of them that looks really bad, you don't want them to, you to lose credibility. Like, what tips would you
How do you
give someone to
balance that?
manage that
Yeah.
process?
I think that's where the baselining part comes in. If you're able to get hands on their data set, like what is the last month of that decision look like, right? Or what is
Yeah.
it, like, depending on the cadence, right? Like, if it's a decision that you're making monthly, great. Like, what is the last month's worth of data, daily, day, right, or intraday, right? Whatever that time horizon is. But getting some sample data to be like, hey, what was the input that you looked at and what was the actual like result, like what did you go do, what was the real world action that you took, and being able to evaluate that against the plan that you're creating, I think is huge. Because if you can go in and say, here, I created this system. I know it's not perfect. I've created this prototype, but this prototype gets within 5%, maybe it's 5% worse. That's fine, right? Of your solution, but I can click a button and it runs in 10 seconds, right? Then I think that like is intriguing a lot of times
Yeah.
to that operator, even if it's not a better solution to start. But also getting like literally just having that button effect of, hey, I clicked a button and I got a reasonable looking thing. Now the best reaction to any of that is, oh, could we do blank?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's perfect.
And
So
then you're in. You're like, okay, great.
you completely set me up. I fell into this exact trap that I would have been saved by your information. I helped build a prototype of a routing system a long time ago.
Yep.
Showed it to the client. The client hated it. It's like, this is terrible. It's no good. And it's way more expensive than what we're currently doing. And then I eventually figured out, well, let's see what you're currently doing. And like, oh, you're violating half the constraints you told me about. Like, okay.
Oh yeah,
And if I had
that's also
baseline, yes, then I would have
yeah.
known
Yes.
that.
But that's also great, right? Like when you get that baseline data, you can ask those types of questions. Like, okay, wait, like you said time windows were super important to you for routing, but it doesn't look like you're actually following that. Like, so how important are they? Or are you okay relaxing them, right?
Right.
Like that sort of
Exactly.
stuff.
Perfect.
Or yeah, or like, scheduling models, pricing models, et cetera. Like all kind of like fit that same role. And I do think a lot of times, right? What are humans like trying to do as they're in that role and they're making these decisions manually? They're trying to limit the space of options, right? Like these decision systems have thousands to millions of options, right, for solutions. And so if you're a manual operator, you're building rules on top of rules to basically trim the space down,
Right.
right? And sometimes those rules actually aren't operationally relevant. They were just used to get you to a space where you could actually make a call, right? And so I think
Right.
that's like also kind of interesting because the computer can evaluate a lot more solutions, right? Than you can faster. So
Yeah, I was thinking that story about the woman who, before she baked ham, she cut the end off. Her daughter said, "Well, why do you cut the end off?" "Well, my mom did."
yeah, exactly, exactly. It's like that.
Mom's still alive, so they go to grandma. "Grandma, why did you cut the ends off the ham?" "Well, that's what my mom did."
Yeah.
Turns out the great grandma's still alive. I said, "Great grandma, why did you cut the end off the ham?" She looks up, she goes, "Well, I think the pan was too small." And all these years later, they're still doing this ritual far after its need has gone away.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that is kind of what happens, and sometimes you uncover rules like that just like aren't actually relevant or aren't driven by any regulation or anything like that. They were just in there from like a legacy perspective and are something that maybe you can relax, and then your system is able to get to maybe a better revenue solution or a better cost solution. So
Carolyn, what do you think are uh, kind of the most interesting trends right now that are driving kind of how decision processes are getting technically implemented and kind of humanly implemented? What's changing? The biggest trends that you see now, the things that are really driving the activity.
yeah.
We've come this far without talking about Gen AI, but maybe we can go no further.
Yeah, I was like, we may go no further. I do see, it's funny you said many tools for operations teams. I think that is true, and I think that list, while growing, I think is also somewhat consolidating behind decision systems, if that makes sense. Like I think people are starting on the technology side to kind of combine decision-making technologies and then provide them as applications for end users, which I think is great, right? I think that means that we're able to connect predictive, machine learning models and things in that space with decision models, right? In a
Right,
deeper way than we ever have been before. And there's some great work going on with like embedding ML models in optimization, like stochastic optimization
Mhm.
solvers, right? There's just a ton going on there, right? And so I think that that's super interesting, and that's making it so that you can capture uncertainty in a way that is honestly like more relevant to operations teams because they think about things a little bit more distributionally, right? Like
right.
what is my P90, right, for a particular decision, that sort of thing. So I think that is a trend that we're definitely seeing, kind of a move towards handling more stochastic kind of decision making. Also, think we're definitely seeing a trend towards chaining decisions together, kind of to the same point on consolidation. Like how do maybe having the individual components that you can manage almost like a simulation, honestly, like a federation of
Mhm.
models, right, that are kind of hooked together or linked together to make these more complex decisions. We're definitely starting to see that. And then the third thing is certainly like Gen AI, more natural language interaction. I think with models is something that we're starting to see a desire for, and two, just some folks in the space are kind of driving that way. So, but yeah, I think those are all the trends
Perfect.
that we've been kind of looking at.
Perfect. That's a perfect way to wrap up. So, as a last thought, is there where can listeners learn more about Nextmv? Is there any books or podcasts you recommend that they listen to or check out?
Oh, yeah. Well, you can certainly learn more about Nextmv on our site, and it is nextmv.io. And so we have a blog, we have some podcast stuff on there. We do run a tech talk series we host a lot of folks in the optimization space, a lot of the different solver companies, a lot of the different people that are doing interesting things in decision science. So we'd love to see you there.
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, this was really fun, Carolyn. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks everybody else. If you like the show, tell a friend. If you didn't like the show, tell a couple of enemies. Follow us. Join our mailing list at decisionintelligencepodcast at gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.